Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Garen, and honestly, thank you all for listening to me. I'm very honored and a touch starstruck by all of the participants here. So I gladly invite your questions and your comments at the end of the presentation. But as was mentioned, my name is Samantha Bingaman. I am a master's candidate at the University of Delaware, and I'm working with some fantastic co-authors, some of which you may recognize, some of whom you may recognize. And today I'm really excited to present our preliminary yet developing findings, or developing yet very intriguing findings of a longitudinal study, Winds of Change, examining attitude changes regarding an offshore wind project. Oops. There we go. So part one and part two, I'm going to really go pretty fast through the why and the how of the study, and then take most of the time to focus on part three and part four. This is a mixed method study, so we've got quantitative and qualitative results. So I'll make that the meat of the presentation, or the tofu if you are a vegetarian. Have to be inclusive of everybody, right? And now I can't hear if you're laughing or scoffing or don't know what I'm saying, but I'm going to go into part one anyway. Basis of the longitudinal research. What do we need to know, and why are we really making this study a longitudinal one? In saying that, I'll reference one of the most well-known cases, at least in the US, of offshore wind failure, Cape Wind. And I say this because we know, many of us do know, that local opposition can delay or lead to failure of offshore wind projects. And I say that non-judgmentally, I say that merely as a matter of fact, and a call to really understand why this opposition can either change or stay stable over time. Thanks to someone in the presentation who many of us know, Martin Wolsink, we can expect a U-shaped social acceptance pattern to occur over the duration of the planning, construction, and operation phases of an offshore wind project, whereas levels of attitude or levels of acceptance generally go down between the planning and construction phase, and then rise again between the construction and operation phases. So once those turbines actually start turning. And as many of you have so eloquently stated in your own writings, we really need to understand these before and after experiences that communities and local people have with nearby offshore wind projects. My focus, I will go, the study setting is actually in the same location as Aaron, so I yield to redundancy. Thanks for your presentation, Aaron. You did a great job of explaining. I'm really happy to go through any more clarifications about the study setting that pertains to this specific study in the question and answer phase. But once again, the database that we're using has survey data from 2016, 2017, and 2018. It was conducted, as I said, in the same setting, but analyzed in a very different way. And for this particular study, that means we have a smaller number of observations to really maximize the number of respondents, although we will go back to the second survey in later or as the project develops further, to analyze any patterns or trends that appear. So I'll be using the first and the third survey and focusing on that in this presentation. Another thing you should know is that our respondents are stratified by location. So I'll present Block Island, meaning the island that you see in this picture. And then if you look really, really closely on the horizon, you might be able to see the other stratum, coastal Rhode Island. This leads right into the research questions. What do we want to know? Well, first, we want to see if attitudes towards the project did change over time or if they didn't change over time. Naturally, a follow-up is, why did the attitudes change? Exploring salient factors along with a specific deductive look at visibility and fit noted by Firestone et al. 2018. And we'll also invoke some attitude research and asking, did attitude shifts or were they influenced by the common attributes of attitudes, meaning confidence in views? Did the respondents' knowledge of the project, did that influence whether the attitude shifted or did it stay stable? So the first result I'd like to present was featured on both of the surveys, and it was the question, do you currently support, oppose, or have not made up your mind about the project? And what we see here is in the aggregate, we have a large amount of supporters, but there's also a considerable amount of undecided and opposers. But by the time, I hope you guys can see this chart moving. Yep, there we go. By the time 2018 rolls around, we see that the support category increases, whereas the first two decrease. This is a significant difference in all of the categories. And from here, we're also able to calculate those that jumped maybe from the support to the undecided, or the support to the opposed category, or vice versa. And we see here that there's a much larger percent, actually a significant difference between those that move to a more positive attitude and those that move to a more negative attitude. But what about Block Island? Looking at them specifically, very similar trends. Support increases over time, whereas undecided and opposed categories decrease. This is significant in the two end categories, and very similar. We see moved negative is a much smaller proportion as opposed to moved positive. Coastal Rhode Island, I don't want to ruin the surprise, but it happens the exact same way. Over time, support increases and the others decrease. Significant in the support and undecided categories, and moved negative and moved positive, similar patterns. So from here, we can answer the first research question, saying that attitudes did become more accepting after construction as the support category grew significantly and more attitudes moved positively. I'd like to now go into talking more about a few selected descriptive statistics, but one way to clarify those next few slides is to categorize, or let you know that we'll be categorizing the subjects in two different ways. The first way is we take those people from the charts that I just showed you, and we categorize them into a 5-category subgroup variable, meaning that we have firm opponents, those that selected on both surveys that they were opposed to the project, those that moved to a more negative viewpoint by the first or by the third survey, those that stayed undecided the whole time, or I have not yet made up my mind on both surveys, moved positive, and then firm supporters. And this just gives us an opportunity to explore nuance. This subgroup variable will also be used as I describe the interviews towards the end of the presentation. I'll also make the transition pretty clear when I move to the 2-category dummy variable that we use in regressions. We're just looking here if attitude shifted or not. And this is to better maximize the number of observations and to better understand the patterns and align with the research questions. This very number-heavy slide shows basically the breakdown of the charts that I showed you, the interactive charts that we're moving. I want to draw your attention to the red, the color coded 259, just saying that across all of the strata we have a very large number of supporters, but in the blue, those that shifted their attitude also do make up a considerable percent of the population. And our goal is to really contrast these people with those firm opposers, undecided, and firm supporters, the stable attitudes. So a few selected descriptive statistics. On the first survey, respondents were asked, what is your general attitude towards wind power? The green bars here denote the weighted proportions of each subgroup that said, yes, I'm favorable towards wind power on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. So they selected a 4 or a 5, 5 being very favorable. And almost a very predictable or to be expected waterfall pattern, we see that most people in the firm support category were favorable towards wind, whereas on the other side of the spectrum, the firm opposers had slightly more than half that were generally unfavorable towards offshore wind power, excuse me. Another interesting result is turbine fit with the landscape. On the first survey and on the third survey as well, they were asked about how do you think the turbines will fit with the landscape versus the third survey, now that you can actually see them, how do they fit? The moved positive, so those that move to a more positive attitude, expectations were exceeded in 60.64% of that population, whereas in the moved negative subgroup, only 2.22% experienced that same exceedance of expectations. So this is not causation, but it definitely gives us something to think about. Maybe this is one of the reasons why people changed their attitudes in the way that they did. The last descriptive statistic I'd like to talk about is on, again, both the first and the third survey. Respondents were asked to rank their top 3 concerns that the turbines could possibly affect. And on the vertical axis, oh, you can't see my cursor. Oh, darn, that's okay. But on the vertical axis here, you see several items that the respondents could select. And on the first survey, this was sort of the layout. We see that electricity cost was a really important option. Renewable energy was a really important option. I do have these graphs or these charts broken down by subgroup and strata as well, but I'm presenting the aggregate because it shows the overall trend instead of charting you to death with 10 different graphs and 10 different variations of pretty much the same thing. So by, this was in 2016, but then by 2018 in the third survey, they're moving, and if you're not paying attention to which way they're moving, that's fine. I wouldn't either because there's so many. The stars here do the work for you. They denote those that either decreased or increased in frequency in a significant way. The green shows increases in those that marked it as a concern, and the red shows those that marked it as not a concern in the third survey, or in the third survey, yes. Switching now to which factors predict the attitude shift. This is our presentation of the regressions. We use a mixed effects probit because we're using panel data, and this is when we switch to that 2 category variable for the dependent binary variable. Did the attitude shift or did it stay stable? The independent variables that we chose to include in the regression are shown here in the table, but the reason that we selected those is because they were not only derived from the survey questionnaire, but they were also driven by our research questions and the general literature. So with a drum roll, these are the effects or the results. I only include the significant predictors here. This is a lot of numbers, so let me go ahead and break it down for you. The attitude shift is predicted if the participant is younger, they don't expect to or cannot see the turbines, they thought turbines would not fit with the landscape in 2016 nor in 2018, so expectations and perception in reality was generally unfavorable. They had a less favorable attitude towards wind power initially. They're not as confident in their views, and that's very consistent with the literature. They view effects on the landscape as a top concern. And this is an interaction variable. Specifically, if you are on Block Island, the people closest to the turbines, 3 miles, 5 kilometers, yes. If you are not only on Block Island, but you also view renewable energy as a top concern, then you're more likely to shift. Now you're probably wondering, okay, that's great. What do we do with this? We don't know which way they shifted. If you're asking that question, you're not the only one, because some of our future directions are also exploring this dependent variable and trying to figure out which direction these people did shift in. So that brings me to one of, or the last part of the presentation. Where do we go from here? We're currently conducting interviews. Actually, I have 2 scheduled for later today, semi-structured and virtual phone interviews with 24 purposively sampled subjects from Block Island and coastal Rhode Island. And the goal is to triangulate these results with the quantitative findings to tell a well-rounded story of change in Rhode Island. This picture here is on the Block Island website. It's some of the Block Island residents and vacationers in a very large social setting. Probably won't see this anytime soon. I also like this picture because it's sort of like an I Spy or a Where's Waldo, like find the guy with the camera, find the twins, find the lady with the baby. So if you're bored, you can do that before I change the slide. Just to give you a flavor of some of the questions that are asked on during the interviews, We asked respondents to put in their own words, did the project or how their opinion about the project changed over time, expectations versus reality, visibility and fit of the turbines. What would you have liked to know about the project? Did you discuss the project with family and friends? Some of the phrases that we've gotten so far is it blends into the background. It's boutique-ish. I thought that was a really creative way to put it. Problem with the process, not the outcome. We survived the worst of it and not as bad as I'd thought they'd be. So again, these interviews are still in progress and we hope to code throughout the summer and come up with some really interesting findings. So with a rather abrupt ending, I want to say thank you all and acknowledge my research team, master's committee, and the funders of my fellowship. And I'm really excited to hear your comments and questions. Thanks, everybody.
Sure. Well, the second presentation pretty much answered it very thoroughly.
Okay.
So I did have a second question, though, about the well, either of the respondents. It was really about, I just typed it in about the role of psychological habituation and possibly in explaining the positive shifts that were dominant and changes over time, whether that phenomenon is considered part of what they're looking what they're looking at, and if so, if they can distinguish that from other effects.
I'll go ahead and respond to that. To be honest, we have not looked into that. That's a great suggestion. I can definitely get back to you about that or respond to any comments line by line if interested.
And another, just to kind of add to that, another future sort of aspect that we're looking at with this data set is a more sort of cognitive versus affective division of the data. But the psychological habituations is not something that I'm particularly familiar with, but it sounds very interesting. And as Sam said, it's something that it sounds like we could definitely look into. So thank you.
Oh, yeah, thanks for those questions, David. Kate, you've got a question. Kate Sharon, did you want to ask that yourself? You can see it on the screen anyway.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much. It is on the screen. I enjoyed both those presentations very much. Fantastic work, really interesting. Aaron, as you were speaking, the data was moving past a little too quickly for me. I've got my son here alongside, and so I might have missed it if you'd gotten into it. But this pristineness, the way that the pristineness variable influenced the two populations very differently, and it made me think: are the folks on the coast kind of having that opposite effect because they're thinking that if it's offshore, then there's not going to be the pressure onshore, and so it's kind of a displacement thing. So it's for them. But again, it moved pretty quickly. So
you're asking about maybe whether or not the folks on the coast are perhaps they consider this to be more of a positive pristineness prediction because the turbines are going to be offshore instead of nearby, and so it's kind of preserving their pristineness onshore. So I think that's a really interesting possibility. And going forward, as Sam is doing, is actually getting a chance to go out and talk to these people a little bit more. I think that's something that could possibly be brought up. It's also just possible that the idea of pristineness and the idea of the coastal and ocean environment is just different between the two populations in a way that we haven't really tacked down yet. But I think your idea has merit, and it's interesting. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Aaron, while you're on that, I think it's Gundla Hubner has also posted a question. While they're going to her, you can just see it there. It's on pristineness as well. I'm wondering, asking if it's correlated with climate change, pristineness.
I don't have the direct answer to that question right now. If I think the question would be, is having pristineness as one of the top place meanings perhaps correlated with concern for climate change? Is that more along the line of what's being asked?
I know, Gundla,
Yes.
do you want? Hi.
Yeah, it's me. Sorry. Yeah, right. So this is my question, because it's very unusual that you have once a negative predictor weight and then in the other sample you do have a positive. So I was thinking about moderators, and one moderator could be the climate, the concern about climate change. So that's the background of my question.
I think that's a very good and interesting question. It's not something that I looked at specifically. It's in the regression, and I could break it down further to see if it's actually having a true effect. They're not necessarily the fact that they're both in the regression model means that we tested them for collinearity. So they're not necessarily those two variables are not necessarily moving with each other enough that we were concerned about it. We know that climate change concern was one of the more significant predictors, was one of the predictors that was either significant or near significant predictor. Let's see, just make sure I'm not telling you a fib for support of the project in general. But yes, I think that's an interesting perspective, an interesting question.
Okay, we've two other questions which we should be able to cover, and then we'll go on to the third presentation. But Rebecca, you've asked a question. Do you want to come on and just verbalize it? You've written it down anyway, it's quite clear, but I don't know if you want to ask it anyway. Hi.
Hello. Yeah, thank you. Really interesting projects and presentations. My thought when I was listening to you was whether people's attitudes would change over a longer period, kind of longer than just the 1 year, and whether the project had considered revisiting this after a longer time period.
Mm-hmm. It has not been discussed yet. I don't think it should be discounted as a possibility. The one thing that may influence that in the future is there are some currently some developments with the power cable, and in the face of that, it might possibly influence attitudes. I would say revisiting this in the future may or may not happen because based on the interview responses so far, many people are saying that it blends into the background. They're sort of filtering it out. So I'm not sure if we would see a lot of development past the attitudes as they are currently right now. But as I said, if there are developments with the cable, or if something breaks, or if something, a new national crisis comes along that really influences the way we think as a whole, not only on Block Island and coastal Rhode Island about wind power and offshore wind in general, that could potentially bring up a good research question. So the answer is it depends. I hope so, and stay tuned.
Thank you.